We're going to be talking about solving equations with what we call the distributive property. The distributive property is something that we used in 7th grade. We can use the distributive property in both two-step and multi-step equations. So we're going to go ahead and talk about this first example. 21 equals 3a minus 2. The first thing I would like you to do is go over to the side, and I want you to identify which are expressions, which are our coefficients, which are our variables, and look to see if we have any constants. So go ahead and write those down on your paper. At any time, if you need to pause this video, it's absolutely fine. So here are our 4 titles. Now, if we look at this, knowing our vocabulary, expressions are those problems with no equal sign. So we have 2 problems here. We have 21 on the left and 3 parentheses a minus 2 on the right. For the coefficients, those are the problems that have a variable and a number together. And in this case, we don't see anything, so we can just say NA, which is not available. For variables, it's our letters, so I see one variable, that is A. And our last one, constants, are those numbers that are all by themselves. I see 3 of them, 21, 3, and -2. Now let's get started with the solving. The first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and I'm going to scoot this over a little bit, and on the side I'm going to write DC ma'am. DC ma'am. Now in 7th grade we had to cancel out all of the first 3. In this case we don't necessarily need to cancel the first 3. So we're going to put add or subtract, multiply or divide. So distributing property is when you have parentheses. So today what we're going to work on is we're going to start going step by step, and we're going to minimize what we're crossing out. We're not going to do the C and the M, but we are going to do the distributive property, adding or subtracting, and multiplying and or dividing. So the first thing that we want to do after writing DC ma'am is draw our wall. Next, what it says here is number 1, before we do anything else, we have to do the distributive property. Well, this is simple. We did this in 7th grade when we drew the 2 boxes. Most of you probably remember this. Don't forget to include the sign that's in front of the 2. Don't just cut it off. And now distributing just means to multiply. So I'm going to multiply 3 times A and 3 times -2. Well, 3 times A just gives me 3A. And 3 times -2, I'm going to go ahead and do my dead man on the side. Make sure everything is nice and organized. You don't just have things written all over the place. I have a +3 and I have a -2. That leaves me with the negative number. And 3 times 2 is 6, so it will be -6. You notice I'm going to rewrite the rest of the problem, put my equal sign and my 21. I know for sure I want you to write at the bottom, this is the goal is to get A by itself. Get A by itself. Make sure you're writing these things down. So we're going to get A all by itself. So we're going to have to move everything else out of the way. So I already did the distributive property. I can put a check mark there. The next thing I need to do, number 2, is either add or subtract. Well, we're always doing the opposite. So now looking at it, this is just a 7th grade problem that you worked on before. So if we want to get A by itself, let's move everything else out of the way. I'm going to add or subtract. Well, the opposite of -6 is +6. So I'm going to go ahead and write that there. And remember, if I do it to one side, I do it to the other. So I'm going to do it to both sides. And I know for sure over on my left-hand side, 21 plus 6 equals 27. I know for sure I still need my equal sign. I know over here on the right hand side I can subtract these and it gives me just 0. So I cross it out. And lastly, I know I can bring down 3a. If you look at the goal, again, it's to get a by itself. So I did the adding or subtracting. The last thing I need to do is either to multiply or divide. So I see here that my coefficient is 3a, or I'm going to say 3 times a. Same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and do the opposite, which is division. So let's divide by 3 because I want to get a all by itself. So I'm going to divide by 3. So 3 goes into 3 one time. Okay? 3 goes into 27 9 times. So now I have 9 equals 1a. This really is an extra step because 1 times a is just the same as a. So the question is, did I meet my goal? Did I get a by itself? Yes. What this answer is saying is 9 is the same or equal to, you can say the same as or equal to a. So when I'm talking about this particular situation, I'm saying a and 9 can be used simultaneously. That means together. So I can go ahead and mark off my last step and I am done. What you're going to do now is you're going to work on this particular try this, and you will be entering it in the answer on the computer. Okay, this is a disclaimer right now. Do not be afraid of that fraction. It is not as hard as it looks. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is let's go ahead and list the coefficients. So we're going to talk about what the coefficients are real quick. So coefficients, remember, co means together. It means you're joined up with something. So in this case, it's when a number and a variable are together. So I can see very quickly that our first coefficient is negative 3y. In fact, that's the only coefficient. Okay, the second thing we're going to look for is variables. What variables do we have? Well, we're looking for a letter. That's right, it's y. Make sure you're writing this down. The next thing we're going to look for is a constant. The constant means it's the one that's constantly alone. It's always alone. It doesn't have a variable with it. So I see 3 constants. I see a negative 6. Notice I put the sign. I see a negative 1/3. And then I see a positive 9. So those are our 3 constants. And then lastly, just like last time, we're going to not only look for coefficients, variables, and constants, but then we're also going to look for our expressions. So expressions. I'm just going to do that. And we always have 2 of them in any equation. We have the left side, which is negative 6. And then we have the right side, which is negative 1/3 minus 3y plus 9. So don't forget, an expression is just a problem without an equal sign. So we're taking 2 different problems and we're putting them together. Now, just as last time, what is our goal? Our goal is to isolate or to get by itself, to isolate y. So we want it by itself is what we're asking for. Okay, so make sure you write that down on your paper so that you always remember what the end result is. If y isn't by itself, you didn't do your job. All right, just remember as last time what we did was we wrote down DC mam. So we're going to do that on the side of our paper again, DC mam. Remember, D stands for distributive property. That means when you see parentheses and you're multiplying. And again, just like we did in 7th grade, we're going to cross some things out. In 7th grade, we crossed out all 3. Now we're just crossing out 2. We're also going to put a S for subtract and a D for divide. Okay, so we have DC mam. Let's go ahead and get started. Don't forget, we always want to draw our wall. There it goes. And the first thing I'm going to look for is right here, the distributive property, the D. Now, let's go ahead and do what we did in 7th grade. We drew our box, and then we separated the two terms. So I'm going to separate them. And again, we're just multiplying things out. So we're going to multiply 1/3 times negative 3y and 1/3 times positive 9. Okay? It's not as hard as it looks. So this time I'm going to write out, without doing it in our heads, I'm going to actually write it out. Negative 1/3 times 3y. I can put a 1 over it if you want. And the other one is negative 1/3 times 9. And I can put a 1 under it if I need to. Okay, so look at how simple this is, you guys. Do you see this 3 and 3 here? Well, when we can cross cancel, but in order for me to just show you the steps, I'm going to show you straight across. And remember, when we multiply fractions, you're multiplying straight across. So when I multiply this thing, I'm going to get negative 3y on top. How do I know that? Because I can do the dead man. Okay, I'm going to squish it in there. And I have a positive and a negative. So I'm going to have a negative answer. So I have negative 3 on top, and then on the bottom I have positive 3. Okay, for the other one, let's multiply again. I'm going to use dead man. Notice all the steps that I write out. That's important. Okay, I have 1 positive, 1 negative. So negative 1 times 9 is negative 9. Again, on the bottom, it's 3. So now we can simplify this thing. 3 goes into negative 3 one time, so now it's 1y. Or, even easier, 1y is just the same as y. So I'm going to erase this 1, okay? The only other thing that you might want to do, or not might want to do, is you have to put the negative. If you want to put the 1, you can. Negative 1y and negative y are the same thing. And then over here we have a negative. 3 goes into 9 3 times. If you're kind of confused where I got the negatives from, remember, dead man can be used for multiplying and dividing. Oops. So you want to put your little dead man. And I have 1 negative and 1 positive. That's how I got negative 3. Okay. On the other side, I'm going to still bring down my negative 6. You see that? So remember, our goal is to get y by itself, or isolate y. Okay, so let's go on. We did distributive, boom, we can check that off. Let's go to adding or subtracting. Okay, so I'm going to always go to the side that has the y. I got to get everything out of there. Okay, so I'm going to do the opposite of minus 3 or negative 3. I'm going to put a plus 3. I'm going to do it on both sides. Okay. So we remember opposite signs right here. If you do 3 and negative, positive 3, negative 3, that gives you 0. So I'm just going to cross that out. So over here, I'm left with negative 1y. And I have my equal sign. And then over here, I'm going to do circle stack. They're different signs, so I'm going to subtract them. We get 3. And my bigger absolute value is negative, so it's negative 3. But I want you to take a look at this. This is not my answer, negative 3. The reason why is because we want to get y by itself. And right now, y is still not by itself. There's a negative there. So what you're going to do is, let me rewrite this over here just for space. You have negative 3 equals negative 1y. So again, this always means multiplication. So I'm going to do the opposite, which is divide by negative 1. That's my last step, and I already marked it out. And I know if I do my dead man, a negative divided by a negative will give me a positive answer. So 1 goes into 3 times. And over here I can cross this out. So now I have y equals 3. And I fulfilled my goal. I got y all by itself. So now what you're going to do is you're going to try this one on your paper. So go ahead and do it. Don't forget, don't be afraid of those fractions. Just multiply straight across. Okay, for the last one, we're going to do the same thing. This time we're not going to identify the vocabulary, but we are going to write DC, ma'am. Remember, D stands for distributive, And this stands for adding or subtracting, multiplying or dividing. I always like to put the parentheses so it reminds me what I'm looking for. Second, let's go ahead and cross out C and M because we don't need that right now. And let's get started. First thing we want to do is draw the wall. The second thing we want to do is write our goal. In this case, we want to isolate D. In other words, we want it by itself. So if you don't have that at the end of your problem, then so either something went wrong or it's not a problem that can be solved. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing is distributive property, which means we're going to look for parentheses, and obviously here they are. So we're going to draw our box just like what we did in 7th grade and separate the two terms. Second, we're going to draw our arrows so we know what we're multiplying. So let's go ahead and multiply the first one, which is -1/4 times 8D. Again, I can put a 1 underneath there. And we're just going to multiply straight across. Okay? So 8 times 1 is 8D. And I'm going to do it up here just because I don't have a lot of room. I'm going to do my dead man since I'm multiplying. And I have one negative and one positive. So I'm going to cross that out. So my answer is going to be -8D. On the bottom, just 4 times 1 is 4. Okay, let's do it for the second one. -1/4 times +1. And I can put a 1 underneath if I want so that I can make everything look nice and balanced. Again, let me draw my dead man way up here on the top. And I have a -1 and a +1. So I know my answer is going to be -1/4. Okay? This -1/4 really can't be simplified, but this one can. I can divide 4 into 8. So let's go up to the top again, and I'll draw another dead man. And I see I have a -8 and a +4. So I know my answer is going to be negative. So 4 goes into 8 2 times. -2D. Plus we still have our -1/4. So we have all of that on one side, and on the other side we still have 7/4. Okay, so that multiplication was just the same thing we did on the last problem. We're multiplying fractions. When you get good at it, you can start doing a lot of things in your head, but for now we are going to make sure we write things out. So got a check mark for distributive. Now let's go to see if we're adding or subtracting. Well, in this case, my opposite of -1/4 is +1/4. Okay, +1/4. So I'm going to do that to both sides. Okay. Now I always know right here, circle stack, they're opposite sides. I subtract and I get 0. So now I end up with -2D. That's all I have left. And I have my equal sign in the middle. Now let's go over here to this one. This is actually a 3rd grade standard. They have common denominators of 4, so I'm going to leave that common denominator. And I do 7 + 1 is 8. Okay? Now, before we go any further, I'm going to draw it up here so that we have a little bit of room. So I'm going to put 8/4 equals -210. You guys notice I can simplify this. I can divide 4 into 8. 4 into 8 goes 2 times. So that's kind of like a side note. That's not on our DC MAM list, but if I can simplify that, that's good. So I can check this off because we did the opposite of negative, which is positive. So we were adding and subtracting. The last thing says multiply or divide. Well, I know this means multiplication. So you do the opposite. Okay? So let's divide by -2. Notice I take the negative with me. We're changing operations. We're not changing signs. Okay? So we're going to multiply or divide. Let me check this off. Again, I always know this gives me 1. And I'm not going to rewrite the whole thing. I'm just going to put D. I'm not going to put 1D. And again, on this side, I can divide 2 into 2 goes 1 time. And I'm going to do my dead man. which is 1 positive, 1 negative. So it's negative 1D. So that is my final answer. Negative 1 equals D, or D equals negative 1. It's the same thing. What it's saying is no matter which way you say it, they're both equal. D is the same as negative 1. Negative 1 is the same as D. Did we isolate D? Did we get our goal? Yes, we did. So we can say check for that one. So lastly, you're going to be working on this particular try this, and then you'll be submitting your answer to see if it's correct.